Morning, and thank you for coming and for joining us this morning at New Day. If you're new or visiting, we're just so glad you're here, and we want you to know that you are welcome in this place. If I haven't met you yet, my name is James, and I'm one of the pastors here at New Day, and you came on kind of an interesting Sunday because this is the last sermon that I'm going to preach as one of the pastors here at this church. And so I never thought that I would say those words, or at least say them for a really, really long time. So you've joined us on an interesting Sunday, but if you're new, I want you to know that I believe wholeheartedly that there's a reason that God brought you to this church, that God brought you here today, because God has a good plan for you and a message for you today, and I truly believe that God orchestrates all things in accordance with this really good will. Like I said, today is my last sermon as one of your pastors, and as I reflect on 37 years of being a part of this faith family, like 37 years being at this church, being born here, being dedicated on the front steps. I got a lot of history in this place. I've been in every crawl space, like in here, ones that you wouldn't even imagine, attics in these old buildings, and I've been in them all. And as I reflect on 8 years as being your executive pastor and being one of your pastors on staff, all I have in my heart is gratitude, just deep, deep gratitude and love for every single person in this room and every single person who's been a part of this journey. What better job could there be than to watch people year after year grow to be more and more like Jesus? It's an incredible job. I'm sure you have an amazing job, whatever you do, but I have an amazing job to get to see people become more and more like their Savior. If you know me, you know my heart, and my heart fully intended to be a part of this church and serve out the strength of my days, until I retired or until the Lord took me. That was my intention until God called me. And God called Sarah and I on a different assignment for reasons beyond our understanding. Being a pastor means that, it doesn't mean that you never wrestle with God or with his plans. It doesn't mean that you never wrestle with God's timing and what he does and how he chooses to orchestrate the events of our lives and his church in this world. But being a follower of Jesus and being an example to the flock does mean that I'm called to be obedient to the one that we all call the King. So when the King says, pack up and go, you pack up and you go. So Sarah and I are moving, I calculated on Google, 1,777 miles away from this building to serve in another part of God's church in New York. In a town called Clifton Park. Feel free to look it up and see where it's at and see that the low last night was 1 degree Fahrenheit. I'm a Texas boy, born and raised, and so that's going to be fun. But when God calls, we go. And maybe there's times in our life or seasons in our life, or maybe there's been a season in the life of our church in which we have felt the stability and have enjoyed the stability. And maybe, and I'll put myself in this camp, maybe for some of us, we forgot that Jesus is the stability and not people and not the church. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1. And if you want to get ahead of the game, feel free to turn there. But as you do that, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered if something was truly worth it? I find myself asking that question a lot over my life, and I have certainly asked this question, as has Sarah, many times over the past couple of months as we have prayed and wrestled with and ultimately said yes to God's call. I've asked that question, is it worth it? Is it worth the uncertainty? Is it worth leaving the familiar? Is it worth moving away from people that you love so deeply? We've asked those questions, and maybe you've had to ask that question in your life at some point, or maybe it's a very relevant question for your life right now. Is it worth it? All change produces uncertainty, and it raises these kinds of questions. Maybe for you, it's like stepping into something new, like a new job or a new relationship, or you're becoming a new parent, and you're asking those kind of questions like, was it worth it? Should I have done this? Oftentimes, we ask that question not at the beginning of things, but we ask it at the middle of things, right? During the middle, when we're persevering and the season is hard. Is this marriage worth it? Was this choice worth it? Is this relationship worth it? We especially ask this question around our faith. I could be honest about that. I ask this question a lot around my faith. Maybe you're new and you're kind of an onlooker to following Jesus, and you're thinking about it and wondering if this is something that you should do, and you're wrestling with that, and you're asking the question, is it worth it? Because it seems like following Jesus has a very high cost, and if you're struggling with that, yes, following Jesus has a very high cost on your life. Or maybe you're in the middle of your season of walking with Jesus, and he hasn't always delivered in the ways that you expected him to, or answered every prayer you expected him to answer. And now, after walking with Jesus for a long time, you've been wounded, you've been disappointed, and you're asking yourself that question again. Is it worth it to continue following him? I've been wounded so much. The tension's real, isn't it? These questions, these doubts, this wondering if it's worth it, like following God is very, very costly. And if you're asking that question, like, is it worth it? If you're having those kind of doubts, I'm right there with you. You are not alone in that. But I have an anchoring truth for us this morning. And if you know me and if you've listened to my preaching, basically every sermon is like the same big kind of like thesis. And I say it in all different kinds of ways and repackage it in all different kinds of ways. And it's a truth that's kind of like anchored my heart as a follower of Jesus, as a personal follower of Jesus, but also as a pastor of this church. And that truth is this, that Jesus is worth the journey. I can't think of a better parting truth to give people that I love. And the older I get, the more that I see that following Jesus is not a sprint. It's a very, very long journey. And the more we walk with Jesus, the good news is the more that we become like him. We get transformed by him, and we see ourselves becoming more and more like him in our life as we get closer and closer to heaven. But let's be honest, that transformation comes at very great cost. Following Jesus is hard, and sometimes we have days where we wonder, like, is it worth the cost? Is it worth all of this? And I want you to know that yes, it is worth every step that you take to Jesus, every sacrifice you make on his behalf, every wound that you receive in your walk with Jesus is totally and absolutely worth it, because the prize that we get is Jesus himself. So we find this truth this morning in a story that has anchored my heart, even in this transition season with Sarah and I. And I think Christmas always has like a certain level of heaviness. Maybe ever since I've become an adult. When I was a kid, it was awesome. But Christmas as an adult has like a certain weight of like heaviness around it. You're reminded of kind of like the hardship of the world. And I'm reminded even in the season of our church is how much like there's a lot going on. There's a lot of hardship. There's a lot of heaviness on our church in this season. And I find this anchoring truth here in Matthew chapter 2. And I just want to walk through it with you over the next couple of, or maybe 30 minutes or so that we can draw this truth and pull it into our hearts. So let's look at verse 1 of Matthew 2. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" So let's stop there for now. So when I read a passage like this, I have to remind myself that every single detail of this passage is packed with meaning, and especially in a book like Matthew's gospel. And I think sometimes when we get really familiar with the story, if you're like me, like every year, let's like dust off the Christmas story, just like we dust off the Christmas trees, we can get very familiar and complacent with this story that has so much meaning and so rich in a part of our own salvation story. Kind of reminds me, like, if you got kids, like you watch like a lot of kids shows. That's my entire TV and movie diet. We just saw like Moana 2 yesterday in the theater, and I watch a lot of Bluey and Curious George and all that kind of stuff. That's the season that we're in. And I noticed that whenever people, like the writers of those shows, they always write on two levels, right? They write one for like the kids, and they got the slapstick comedy and all that kind of stuff, but then they're always writing on another level. Like all the jokes that like the parents get and the things that the parents feel, right, that they relate to. And I think in the same way, Matthew calls us to be very mature readers of his gospel and remind us of how rich a history we see in here. Let me give you a couple of examples. He starts out by talking about Bethlehem of Judea. And we think, just as modern readers, oh, that's just the birthplace of Jesus where it happened to happen. But Matthew's pointing out here that like Jesus is born not in like the capital city, but in a small, unassuming town. He comes by dark of night in a small town that you would not expect him to come to. Jesus is pointing that the king has humble origins. And it talks about in the days of King Herod. Here's the tension right here, right? The Magi, these wise men from the east, which we'll talk about in a second, they're coming from like a long way away to worship the king. Guess what? There's already a king. And we're going to see conflict and tension in that. And then there's wise men from the east. We don't know much about these guys, but we know they're from the east. We know they're from far away. We know they're not Jews. So they're outsiders coming to worship the king. It's packed with meaning and significance for us as outsiders to the kingdom of God, entering and being invited to join into this story. And we also have them saying, we have come to worship the King of the Jews. These men recognize who they're coming to see. They're coming to worship the true God. So this story, as every story in the Bible, and especially the Christmas stories and accounts, are all full of deep, rich meaning. And as we think about our own journeys, I want us to see some parallels here with the Magi and with these wise men and the journey that they're on. And think about them as people. They don't know their future. They don't know what happens in Matthew chapter 3, just like we don't know what happens in the next chapter of our life. And yet these people are set up as examples of the faith, of what it looks like to be people who follow the call of God even into the unknown. So here's the point. In the journey, Jesus is worth the disruption. Every journey with Jesus, including your own, began with a disruption. You don't meet Jesus on the road and keep going the same way that you've been going. Like definitionally, you cannot do that because to follow Jesus means you leave everything behind to follow him. Meeting Jesus is meeting a disruption that changes your life forever. Think about these men. I love how they're unnamed, right? They don't have names in the Bible, and I think that's to help us relate to them. Like we could be standing in the story, we could be standing in their shoes. They left behind everything. Homes, comfort, routines, they risk it all because they believed that the king was worth finding. Think about this journey. It could have taken maybe months, could have taken maybe years. Think about all the preparation it takes to make a journey like that. It's not like just like booking a flight on Southwest. You got to go down dangerous lands and trails to travel. Think about all the years of study. These were like astrologists. They had like a special skill set. They were obviously spiritually attuned to something that God was doing, and all the years of studying the signs and the stars until they see something supernatural. Obviously, something supernatural is happening here as they follow this astronomical event. But they believed the king was worth finding, so they disrupted their lives and they embraced the disruption. I think for all of us, whether it's first starting with Jesus or even in your personal walk with Jesus right now, disruption often signals an invitation for us to trust Jesus more deeply. Right? Think about it. When everything is like predictable and comfortable in your life, we can manage that pretty well. We can rely on ourselves. We are very good managers of the comfortable and the predictable in our life. But then the disruption comes. Be a job loss, the health diagnosis, the broken relationship, or even a call into the unknown. Suddenly, the ground begins to shift beneath us, and the safety nets we built for ourselves, they break. And it's in that moment, in that crisis, in that disruption, in which the limits of our own control over our lives is exposed. And in that faith moment, we're called to make a choice. Are we going to rely on ourselves and maintain control, or are we going to surrender to the one who knows the beginning from the end? The disruption in your life is an opportunity for you to trust the one who created you, even when it doesn't make sense. Let me give you an example. My wife and I, the other day, we celebrated 7 years together, wedding anniversary, just really excited about that. Yeah, it was a long journey for us, and we decided to do something a little bit different. We went to a place called Meow Wolf. Meow Wolf, has anyone heard of that before? Okay, a couple of people. Has anyone been to one of those before? Okay, fewer people. It's hard to describe what this place is. Do we have the pic? Okay, yeah. It's an interactive exhibit. It's like walking into like a dream or maybe like a nightmare. Okay, it's like walking into like your worst nightmare almost. And you pay for that, you pay $50 for that. And so we walk into this place and it's this exhibit and it's very disorienting, right? Like you walk in, it's like a giant warehouse in East Downtown. It's already sketchy being over there, right? And then you walk into this building and you just walk through rooms. They're like, walk you to the front, and they're like, hey, download this app. It'll kind of help you along the way. And then they open the door, and then you walk into like the nightmare, right? And there's like a neon forest, and then from the neon forest, you like walk into this like surreal, like Salvador Dali type room, and there's like sounds and like crackling noises. It's like a haunted house, but like not quite, right? But as you begin to walk through there, you begin to see kind of like the patterns and the story, and you use the app, and it lets you like find clues that kind of help you go along the way. And so at the very beginning, you're like, I'm not quite sure where I'm going, but at the very end, you're like, okay, I kind of see what this place is and where I'm being leaded and where I'm being led and directed, right? And I think in the same way, it's true of our lives. Following Jesus feels like that. You step into unknown rooms. You step into unknown things because Jesus doesn't allow you to see the future. You can't see 1 second into your future. Jesus doesn't want you to look at that. He wants you to look at him. That's the question of faith. Will we move forward even in the disorientation of our lives? And will we trust him in that disorientation? And these wise men are such a example of the faith. All they had to go off of was a star. That seems weird. I think God's doing something there. I'm going to follow that thing. But they believed that it was worth it in the end. I wonder for you in your life, where is Jesus disrupting your life? I can talk about me, and I can talk about Sarah and I's journey and how God's disrupting our life, or we can look at others in our church or in our church as a whole. We can see the disruption and this disorientation, but where's God disrupting your life right now? Disruption isn't something that we just have to endure and make it through like the valley of the shadow of death. It's also an opportunity for us to grow and to trust and to let go of control and hang on to Jesus. I mean, you know this. Like, Jesus allows us to go through stuff because it unlocks, if you will, an element of our faith or an aspect of our faith or a depth of our faith that we would not have received if we have not walked through that thing. You can't have that faith unless you walk through the thing that produces that faith. That's what disruption does in our life. It forces us to lean deeper on his promises, to believe more deeply that he is who he says he is, and to rest on the truth that everything is good, even when it feels like it's bad. Amazing things happen when God's people embrace the disruption and they're faithful through it. I'll give you just one example. This church in so many ways is my life, and I've lived, eaten, breathed like New Day for the past 8 years. I think I calculated over like 30,000 hours like in this building with you guys, loving and serving and just doing life together with you. And I'm reminded that every single one of us sitting here right now, enjoying this faith family, enjoying this church and this service, is enjoying the fruit of a disruption that happened 5 years ago when God's people at this church left behind the familiar of White Oak Baptist Church and stepped into something new called New Day Church. And we are all sitting in the fruit of that disruption. Maybe you have testimonies from your own life of when you were faithful to walk through the disruption, and on the other side of it, beautiful and wonderful and faithful things happened in the midst of it. So there's going to be disruption in your life. You don't get to choose that. When you follow Jesus, you don't get to choose where you get to go because you're following Jesus. And in the same way, you don't get to choose the disruptions that happen in the journey along the way. But let's keep going. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 3. Let's keep going on in our passage. It says, when Herod, the king, heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will be shepherd over my people Israel. Verse 7, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I may come and worship him. So here we see kind of an unfolding of God's cosmic plan, how God's plan for the cosmos and for his people comes in conflict with the political and spiritual opposition of the day. Everyone knows Herod is this paranoid ruler. He killed some of his wives. He would kill family members if he thought that they were after his throne. He's known for his brutality. And he was threatened by news that a king of the Jews had been born. And so he sought answers from these religious leaders, which I love how the religious leaders, they know where the Christ was going to be born, and then they hear that this thing has happened, and they don't even go to look for themselves. It just shows how out of touch they were with God's plan and how cold-hearted they were and callous to what God was doing. Herod himself didn't want to come and worship the king. He wanted to be the king. But meanwhile, the Magi, these foreign seekers, followed the star in faith. So I think this passage also shows us that disruption is going to happen, but also opposition is going to happen in your walk with Jesus. And even in the opposition, Jesus is worth that. He is worth the opposition in the journey. The Magi were met with opposition and confusion, but they pressed on. They didn't allow it to stop. They didn't stop at the slightest resistance to their journey. Opposition is not a detour, it's a central part of the journey. And as followers of Jesus, we have to hold two truths in tension, and I think those two truths come out of John chapter 16, verse 33, and it says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. This is what Jesus tells his followers as they're mourning what's about to happen. So there's two truths in tension. Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Both are true. Having the trouble does not negate the overcoming, and the overcoming does not negate the trouble. You got to have both. Opposition will come in our walk with Jesus. Trouble will come. Jesus promises that. You are not the exception to the rule. No one in here is the exception. Trouble will come. But we're called to take heart, to have courage, to press on because Jesus has overcome. So whatever opposition you're facing, God knew. God knew. You didn't know, but God knew. God knows every step of your journey. He knows the beginning from the end. God knew. And it's one of the most comforting things that we could ever ponder or think about, that God knew everything that's going to happen in your life. He knows what's going to happen in the future. He knows about the sickness. He knows about the change. He knows about the loss. He knows it all. And it's a deep step of faith for us to wrestle with the idea that God knew, and he still lets it happen. That's a deep paradox of God's love, that he loves you and he lets it happen. And I would say the deepest level of faith is recognizing that he lets it happen because he loves you. And he is doing something, not just in this life, but in the one to come. So we're called in our journey with Jesus to face the opposition, and that could be from the outside. You know, it's hard to follow Jesus in this world. It's hard to stand up for him. It's hard to be a faithful follower of Jesus because the entire world is calling you to capitulate to a culture that is basically throwing the finger to God, and we are tempted to join into that culture. But oftentimes the opposition comes right within our hearts, right? There's already a king in our hearts, and that king is us. And part of the Christian journey is constantly overthrowing that king, overthrowing our desires, overthrowing what we want for our life and the plan that we have, overthrowing that king because the true king has come. In the midst of all that, I believe that Jesus is worth the opposition. That we go through all of this, we face all of these things. Jesus says, the world hated me first, it's going to hate you as well. But it is all worth it because we get Jesus on the other side of it. Let's look at verse 9 through 12 and finish out our passage this morning. It says, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that had been seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. And I always like this passage because I don't know if you grew up with like the nativity scenes, or you've seen those, and they always have like the, baby Jesus, and they got the cows and the sheep, and Joseph and Mary, and then like the shepherds, and then the Magi are kind of like looking on, and it's a good like biblical accuracy point that these men probably came a lot later, that maybe Jesus was like 1 or 2 years old or so. It kind of took some time for them to get there. And so I remember when I was a kid, or when I learned that actually through my Sunday school class that my dad taught me, I would move the wise men like away from the nativity scene. It's like historically accurate, it's like, oh, well, actually they're over there in the kitchen, right now, and they're on their way. But we see something true of these men, a good faith example for us, and that when they found Jesus, they didn't hold back. They brought these amazing gifts. These are obviously men of influence and power and wealth, and they come bringing the best, gold and frankincense and myrrh, these treasures that they lay before the feet of this child king. And I think in this Christmas season, as we're more reflective, if we're thinking about our life, as we're thinking about the year or years to come, I think the Magi give us an amazing example that we are to follow, that Jesus is worth your best. Jesus is worth your best. You see these three gifts, and there's, again, so much imagery packed in these. You got gold, which represents Jesus' royalty, that Jesus is the king. You have frankincense, which often was associated with spiritual worship, and so it emphasizes that Jesus is God. He's the king who's come down. And then myrrh, which represents his humanity, is often used as a perfume and anointing. And so you see all of these things at play. It's just so beautiful. I just want you to imagine it. These wise men of influence and power and knowledge and fame in their land, traveled to another land thousands of miles, and they follow a star, and they get to this place in front of this child, and then they get down on their knees before him, and they lay their gifts down. How much more so should we be people who give the King our best? The best of the strength of our years, when we have our strength, when we have our health, are we giving Jesus the best of those years? Through the sickness, through the illness, through the disruption, are we giving Jesus our best, everything that we can give him? Through our platforms, through our jobs, are we giving him the best? We give him the best not because Jesus demands it, but because Jesus deserves it. The King who has come into the world. I have a question for you. What's holding you back from giving Jesus your best? Worship was never about convenience. It's always about sacrifice. It's always about sacrifice because we live in a fallen world, and so we always have to face opposition. We always have to die to self to worship Jesus, and therefore we have to be people who are committed to giving our best to the King who calls us to do so. Where's he calling you to sacrifice in this season? What does it look like to give him the first fruits of your time, of your money, of your life, of your vision for the future? Can we be a people who are not holding back but giving our best? Let me give you just a dumb example. This is my last dumb illustration for you guys as one of your pastors, but I'm just going to give it because I thought it was so good. Just imagine someone really important is coming to your house. Really, really important. It could be a famous person. Maybe it's like your first date with your spouse or whatever, like with your relationship, and they're coming to your house, and you're preparing dinner for them. And the whole day, you don't prep, you don't do anything. And then about 15 minutes before they come, you open the fridge, and you're looking around, and you see like Tuesday's pizza, and like Wednesday's casserole. It's kind of questionable. And then like Thursday's like sausage, and like you like pop the the little Rubbermaid container or whatever, and you kind of like give it a sniff, and you're like, all right, pass the sniff test. And you take that, you throw it in the microwave, and you nuke it for 5 minutes. And you pop it out, and you set it before this guest of honor. And you give him a fork, and you say, I hope you enjoy it. Hopefully you wouldn't do that. Hopefully no one would do that, or that you've never done that. But I absolutely believe that we have all been guilty of doing that for Christ. That we give our first, the strength of our life, the strength of our schedule. We give the first of our money. We give the first of our time and the first of our future, not to Christ, but to our own plans, to our own convenience, to our own comfort. And then we give Jesus the leftovers and say, this is what I got. This will do. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? And yet we're all guilty of it. I don't want to set out on this journey with Jesus, get to the very end of it, and come before Jesus either empty-handed or with the leftovers of my time and of my life. And there's so many practical ways that you can do that. It could be your time as you serve other people in this season, or not just about yourself, but you're truly serving. I mean, one very practical way for our church is we have a giving need in this season of $100,000, and we're calling people to give the first fruits, a first gift in this season, not the leftovers. And I got to tell you, as the month goes on, like my real talk, I can do this, I guess, because of like parting words. My real talk is as the month goes on and we haven't given to Jesus, like we're more and more coming into the territory of leftovers, right? Because we're getting to the end of the month. I think we have about 20,000 left that we have to raise as a church, and I absolutely know that we have that in this room. We have 20,000 in this room. I pastored you guys for 8 years. I know it's in this room. It's just, are we committed to the mission and hope of Jesus more than we're committed to our own security, our own life, our own future? We have to be a people who are committed, not giving him the rest, but giving him our best, because Jesus is worth it. And I'll never forget kind of the early days, it felt like, of this church, when it felt like people just man, you could feel it, like the excitement and the tension and what's going to happen in the future and people stepping up in so many different ways. And that still happens even to this day, which what makes this an amazing church. But I don't want us to be a people who get complacent because everything feels good or everything feels like it's stable. I want us to be a people who are always giving Jesus our best. Always radically serving, always radically giving, because not just for ourselves, but because we're now an example to a movement of churches, to a people who are looking to us to see if we're going to lead the way at what it means to be a biblical and missional church in our day. And I hope that you will join us on that mission. So we draw to a close this morning. I want to take a step back and just take a step back and focus not just on our journey, but maybe like flip it around and think about it from like a different perspective. And remember that like we're not the only ones who went on a journey, that Jesus himself went on a journey. Think about it from his perspective. No, it's hard to do because he's Jesus, but think about it from his perspective. Heaven to earth, crossing distance, time, space, matter, the billion things that have to be defied in order for God to become human. He did all of that to crash land in a dark world that we screwed up, unbeknownst to the powers that be, in a little manger in a little town called Bethlehem. God made flesh so that the flesh could be crucified. Here's the incredible truth, is that you were worth the journey for Jesus. You were worth the journey for Jesus. I think a lot of times in church we forget that like we're worshiping a person.